land hunters, and this kind of certainly carries over to if you're hunting private lands too, but is to think about things on a broad scale and then try to narrow it down. So a lot of what we're going to be talking about today is kind of going over maps and trying to identify some of these potential areas, and then what are we looking for when we actually get boots on the ground and actually get out there and look at what the topography is telling us, what is the habitat telling us, what is the landscape telling us, and finally what is the sign telling us.
A
So
lot
I
of
like
times
to
it might be different things selecting the area other than just your personal choice. Like for example, I drew a firearms tag at Ray Norbit. So that encourages me to scout there because of a tag I drew.
sure.
We talked to participants that had IRAP sites and they brought in maps of those locations. So all kinds of things can have you looking to scout a new piece of property.
Absolutely. And one of the things I think that's really important, especially with deer scouting, is understanding the, let's say, the seasonal behavior of the species that obviously we're trying to hunt, right? If we do a lot of scouting in the summer, to get ready for preseason, and you focus heavily on where are they feeding, well, that's going to change largely, especially as fall comes in. In Illinois, I like to describe the landscape as almost a virtual buffet for wildlife. There's so many soybeans, there's so much corn, there is readily food available. And so oftentimes you're going to start to see these deer shift their patterns from kind of a quote unquote summer pattern to a more fall pattern where they're feeding on acorns and different, natural and wild food sources. And so in my preseason scouting, I don't do a ton of focus on feeding. I focus heavily on bedding. If I can figure out where these deer are spending the vast majority of their time. Bedding is kind of the behavior that deer do more than any other. They're, I don't want to say lazy, but they do a lot of bedding. And so being able to pinpoint where these bedding locations are is extremely valuable. And so we're going to first start off with just a quick rundown of what we're looking for in this kind of preseason scouting period. And then we'll kind of go right into looking at some maps, showing some different bedding locations that particularly bucks like to use. And then we'll kind of round it out with a little bit of some kind of boots on the ground scouting to kind of tie things up. But so for this preseason scouting, what we're really talking about is kind of right now, August and September. Um, I do a little bit of scouting in late July. I actually started a little bit earlier this year, but I found the earlier you get in the summer, you're not getting a lot of really kind of critical and useful intel. So we want to make sure we're timing our scouting good. And one of the things that I'm looking for a lot, and I apologize for the quality of this video on the right, it was shot from a cell phone looking through a binocular, so it's not the easiest thing in the world. But a lot of what I'm doing, especially if I'm just trying to get an inventory of deer, or I'm just maybe trying to find a new property to hunt. Maybe I want to go and try to find some private access. I'm doing a lot of roadside scouting, looking at my favorite is green soybean fields. And I want to emphasize that green aspect. Once those beans start to turn, the deer are going to start to move away from them. They really don't like them when they're yellow. So they like them when they're green, and then they like them when they're completely ready in the fall and winter, when they're completely brown and those seeds are ready to eat. They'll kind of start back on that food source. So it can be a really good way to find bucks, especially because this time of year they're going to be what we call in bachelor groups. As this we can see in these pictures here as well as the video, these deer are still in full velvet, and so this is kind of a vascularized sheath that allows the antler to grow. Once that antler's done growing and they start to shed that velvet, that's when you're going to start to see kind of this natural divergence away from bachelor groups. And these bucks are going to be a lot more solitary, and they're going to start kind of honing in on what I would consider their fall or winter range, where they're kind of establish a territory and start to almost defend that territory to some extent. So what I really like to focus on this year is bedding. If or this time of year is bedding. If you can find bedding, chances are a deer is going to continue using those bedding areas. Deer are very picky about their beds, and if they find an area that's safe, that's secluded, that feels good, they're going to continue coming back over and over and over. So here's kind of another quick illustration of what I'm talking about when I'm talking about just kind of road scouting, looking for bachelor groups. And even if you just want to go observe deer behavior, I highly recommend really the next like 2 or 3 weeks before those beans start to turn yellow can be an amazing time to really see a lot of deer concentrated in one area. And so you can see a lot of bachelor groups. You'll also occasionally find some big doe family groups in there as well. But primarily, you're going to see a lot of big bachelor groups that may have 4 bucks in it. It may have as much as 12. Now, I do want to emphasize that scouting does not just occur in the preseason. And I think this is, I don't want to say a product of kind of social media, but one thing I see a lot of people really focus on is scouting in August and September, and then they just completely stop. And again, kind of what we just emphasized, that deer's behavior is very seasonal. It's changing throughout the year. If we just focus and use all that information that we got in the summer and then fall comes, there's going to be a pretty big divergence in what areas they're using. And so I like to do a lot of in-season scouting as well. And this can largely be while you're out hunting. So if I'm doing a morning sit, I may hunt till 10:30 and then start to climb down and make my way back to the vehicle for lunch. I may take a little bit of a longer route just so I can try to search for some new ground, try to look for rubs and scrapes, which very are going to become very common on the landscape starting in kind of mid to late October. So it can be a great opportunity to get out, do a little bit more scouting. Now, I do want to emphasize I'm not doing this, on Saturday morning at 7:30 a.m. on public land. I'm doing this when I don't expect a lot of people to be out there. So again, it may be in that middle of the day when the vast majority of hunters are either in their truck or they went home for lunch. A lot of people don't sit all day in a tree stand, so it can be a really good time to focus just a little bit more scouting effort while you're out there. I do want to also emphasize I'm not scouting bedding areas during season, and that's kind of why I like to emphasize so much in the preseason scouting of focusing on those bedding areas. If I go into a buck bedding area, like you'll see in a couple of our videos later on in this webinar tonight, you're going to find fresh deer. We found, 3 bucks we kicked out of there. We found a fresh buck bed that smelled like he just urinated in it about 10 or 15 minutes before we got there. Well, I'm far enough away from the hunting season that if I happen to bump that buck out of his bed, he's not going to be totally out of out of the world. He's not going to blow out and just take off running to where he'll never see that bed again. If you do that in October or November, you may never see him use that bed again. And so I like to do a lot of my bed searching and bed scouting this time of year. And scouting is really trying to find point A and point B. Largely point A is going to be that bedding, and point B is going to be that feeding area. And what we're trying to do is figure out how they're transitioning between the two. And if I can already come into the season with a very strong foundation of that point A or of that bedding area, that's going to give me a pretty big advantage as the seasons progress. I also do a lot of late season scouting. I know Curtis does as well, whether it's in the dead of winter. What I highly recommend, if you've never been squirrel hunting or rabbit hunting, there's a lot of other hunting opportunities that take place after that uh, deer season closes in mid-January. There's some more opportunities out there. So even if it's just as simple as grabbing your shotgun and going to try to harvest some squirrels for a quick dinner, you can use that time to scout too. Also shed hunt. But what I find really interesting about the postseason scouting is you can get a lot of really good intel on what those deer are doing in fall and winter, especially if you wait like 3 or 4 weeks after season closes. Those deer are still going to be largely on kind of their fall winter patterns, and you can really start to see when pressure comes out of the woods. So that's going to happen again mid-January. Hunting season closes, the deer start to transition back to their normal behavior where they're not, largely nocturnal. They're spending more time up on their feet during daylight hours. You can get a lot of really good information with a good snowfall after about 3 to 4 weeks after that season closes. So keep that in mind too, that scouting doesn't end just because deer season starts or just because deer season ends.
You can mix in some early season hunting with scouting
Sure,
also.
absolutely.
We got squirrel, we got dove coming up, got teal, all these things, early goose, all these things happen before deer season starts. You're going to be out there anyway. Use it as a chance to learn more. Every time you scout, every time you go, the odds are a little bit tipping in your favor, you know. Take every advantage you can get.
Absolutely. And especially if we keep getting weather like this. I know I was itching to get out there today. Didn't make it out there, but it's starting to feel like fall out there. And I think we have 4 or 5 days before this big heat dome comes in, next week, that's going to heat things back up. But when you get days like today, it's It's a real good opportunity to get out, do some scouting, and like Curtis said, do some squirrel hunting while you're out there.
Yeah, multi use, but you know, you also have to consider what reasons are you scouting. I know Dan and I, we're both scouting for similar reasons. We're trying to find a really big buck, you know, like right now, that's what we're doing. It's not a problem to find deer. We're looking for big bucks, especially my spot's a little bit further away. I kind of need something that's exciting to make me want to make that drive, you know,
Absolutely.
not that I'm all about big bucks. I've never in my life been what I'd consider a buck hunter, but after drawing this tag, I guess this year I'm gonna be for 1 year. I'm gonna try it out. So we'll see. I'll report back after the season if I like being a buck hunter, or my normal strategy, just so you all know, is just deer hunter. I go and I fill my tags, I fill my freezer, and I duck hunt and I do fun, exciting hunting. Because deer hunting is really, it's slow, it's a great time to meditate, just think about things, but it's definitely not fast paced. You're not moving around, you can't talk, you can't do any of that stuff. So a little bit of a new strategy for me, but so that's why right now antlers are fully developed. So it is a good time to put cameras out. You might be ahead of some of the other people, but if you're just looking to hunt a deer, there's really no reason to get cameras out this early. You need intel that's a week or two from when you're hunting.
Agreed. And you'll kind of hear that carry throughout this webinar tonight. We'll focus on buck bedding, what we call buck bedding areas or potential buck bedding areas. This largely applies for deer just at large too. So just because we may say that this looks like a prominent buck bedding location, there very well could be a family of does using that. And I'll kind of give a little bit of a background about kind of my hunting strategy for this upcoming year too. Like Curtis mentioned, trying to get, a nice buck on the ground. For me, it's never been particularly difficult to get one or two deer in the freezer rather quickly in the first couple weeks of the season for me. And so that's kind of my normal strategy is I'll try to fill the freezer with a couple does through October, and then that gives me what I like to consider my time to hunt is like October 27th through kind of that first week of November, really. And that's when I'm largely targeting bucks. After that, I'll switch back to trying to fill my freezer if I still want one or two more to just kind of bulk up the freezer a little bit. But for me, again, I like to really focus on trying to find these bedding areas, and I think that's what's so intriguing to me about mature bucks is they are extremely specific, extremely careful, and they don't get old by being stupid. I will assure you, especially like Curtis and I, we exclusively hunt public land. We don't hunt private land. Not saying I wouldn't, I just don't happen to have access. And so for me, it's kind of that challenge and reward of being able to outsmart this animal in its own environment, and especially an animal that's been around, it's lived a solid, a good life, and being able to harvest that. And so we'll kind of carry on now back to a few different kind of sign that's important to note before we really start getting into looking at maps. Like we talked about kind of extensively, for me, this time of year, I'm focused on trying to identify beds. I want to figure out where these deer are sleeping. I want to figure out when they're sleeping there, and that will give you a lot of good information as fall approaches. Now, they will certainly shift their bedding locations a little bit, but especially does, if they find an area that's advantageous for a big family group of does to continue bedding in there and they haven't been disturbed, they've been safe, they'll continue to use those over and over and over again. And so I really like to try to identify these beds. Now, mature bucks are a little bit more picky. They will, so I guess to give it some background, a buck, he's going to bed alone. He wants to be in his own solitary bed, where a doe, she's going to bed with a family group. It may be her two twins from this recent drop just in spring and summer. It could be a couple other family groups, but they rely on numbers. Where a buck, he's relying on his own senses to detect any predators or detect any danger. Where those females, they're relying on kind of this concept of numbers. They have lots of eyes out there, they have lots of ears out there, they have lots of noses going, and so they aren't as particular, especially as it relates to wind direction. A buck will choose a specific bed based on the dominant wind direction for that day. It's very common, and we'll go over some examples. And you can, after you start to understand where a buck might bed, you'll be able to start, coming up with 4 or 5 spots in your specific area that look like a buck could be bedding there, and you can start to pinpoint, oh, I think it's going to be bedded there today because the wind is coming, up from the southwest and blowing northeast. So beds are very important. And I want to talk a little bit about a few what I consider very common bedding locations. And again, these can either be bucks or does, but typically a lot of these are going to be those solitary buck beds, as not necessarily this first one, the south facing slope. This is very common to find family groups. But essentially the south facing slope bedding, we've all heard of the company North Face. The whole reason that brand exists is because the north faces of slope are going to be the harshest climate. They're going to be cold, they're going to be windier, they're going to be a lot gnarlier. Where on the south facing slope, so that portion of a slope that faces south gets a lot more sun throughout the day, so it's getting more solar radiation. It's going to generally be warmer on average because of this increased solar radiation, but it's also going to have a much different vegetation structure and vegetation diversity. It's going to be a lot more diverse than that north side of the slope. It's also going to be a lot thicker, and so it can oftentimes create excellent bedding areas, particularly for family groups of does. Now, when I find south facing slopes to be extremely advantageous is on those cold, frigid days. Like last year, we had that polar vortex come through. I was too chicken to try to get out to deer hunt, I won't lie. But if I would have been out there, I would have been focused on an area that's near a south facing sloped bedding area, because chances are that's where they're going to be. It's kind of what we consider a thermal bed. So it allows them to thermoregulate a little bit, and they are extremely productive during cold temperatures. Now, if you're not familiar with kind of this map structure that we're looking at, I do want to emphasize a few different kind of key features that are important to know as we kind of transition through these bedding areas. You can see these brown lines that are kind of snaking across the map. These are what we call contour lines. And so these are lines that are depicting elevation changes. So it's important to remember a couple things about contour lines. One, they never cross, so they never intersect. You'll never see two contour lines crossing. It's essentially a closed loop from start to finish. And if you were to walk from the start of that contour line and follow that contour line around the landscape, you should not go up or down in elevation. You're going to stay consistent. The closer those contour lines are together, the steeper the slope is going to be. If they're further apart, it's going to be a more gentler slope. And so you can see on the south side of this slope here, we have about a 50-foot change from the top of that slope to the bottom, and that's a pretty significant slope, and so that's going to be a fairly steep slope. So just kind of keep those concepts in mind as we kind of progress forward. And if you're ever on a contour map and you're kind of completely lost, it will happen where you're like, I can't tell what's the top or what's the bottom. If you look for these darker contour lines that we've got kind of circled here, those will give you the exact elevation of that specific contour line. And so it gives you a nice starting point to go down. And so you can see we have this top one at 650. And this bottom one we can see is another index contour line. And if we were to follow that, now we know that's 600. So now we know we have a 50-foot kind of drop in elevation on that slope. I do want to emphasize the exact same thing is true. If it's a very hot day, the north side of the slope is going to offer more shade. It's going to offer more thermal cover, but not necessarily to keep warm, but to cool off. It's going to get more of the dominant wind direction. And so if it's very hot, especially if it's, we always get these 1 or 2 weeks. I think it was 2 years ago. I shot a buck opening weekend of firearm season, and I was in a t-shirt and vest. It was that warm. It was in the 70s when I shot that deer. It was bedding on the north side of a slope. He's already got a lot of his winter coat is starting to develop. He's starting to put on his fat reserves a little bit. They need to keep cool. And so don't always just focus on the south facing slopes on cold. Also, you can think about north facing slopes when it's a little bit warmer.
I try to ask myself, consider your own comfort.
Hmm.
Each day look at the weather and be like, okay, where would I be the most comfortable? Given that south is going to be the most sun, west in the evening also. Maybe you've got a hard northwest wind and you can tuck in away from that. But we've all been walking around the woods and you get to a spot and you're like, oh man, it feels like 10 degrees warmer. It's like a
Yeah,
microclimate, or 10 degrees cooler. And that can be a big difference. Deer are always wearing their fur coat. They can't take it off. So if all of a sudden it gets hot in November, whoo, you better believe they're going to be in the north. They're going to be in the breeze. Even those big bucks that normally like to be in the sticks, they might have to be out in the open and panting because it's hot.
absolutely. And we should kind of also clarify that this doesn't hold true just for deer. When I'm out squirrel hunting, that's honestly one of the first things I pay attention to. First is the wind blowing, because if it is and it's blowing hard, they're going to be down hunkered down in the bottoms. They're not going to be up in the treetops. But two, I'm looking at thinking about the north or south facing slopes. It's great for squirrel. It's great for rabbit. Not necessarily is great for upland, because typically where you're hunting uplands, it's fairly flat in this state. But keep that in mind. It's not just for deer. So this next kind of bedding idea, for lack of a better term, I want to talk about is leeward bedding, and this is one that I find a lot of bucks do, um, especially as pressure starts to build on public land. So again, I mentioned I hunt public land exclusively, and you'll hear me kind of use this term pressure throughout the webinar tonight. And all that means is hunting season's open and people are out in the woods. Um, but the interesting thing about leeward bedding is it offers deer a lot of sanctuary without having to be too specific about a bedding location. And so all we're really talking about when we talk about leeward bedding is being on the backside of a slope out of the wind. Now, what this really does is we have this concept, and I should clarify, usually when they're on kind of a leeward bed, they're going to be about 2/3 up that slope. So they're not going to be all the way down at the bottom or all the way at the top. It seems to really focus on kind of that 2/3 up the slope. And what happens is you have this dominant wind direction coming over the slope. So now it's bringing any scent molecules. Remember, deer's number one sense that they're relying on for predator detection and avoidance is that nose. And a lot of times, especially bucks, they're going to choose a bedding location so that they can use that nose. And being on the leeward side, it's going to cause that dominant wind to carry any scent coming from over there. So boom, they've already got that whole side covered. They can smell anything that's coming that way. Now, anything trying to sneak up from the bottoms, we have this concept of thermals. And so this is when the sun comes up, it starts to heat the surface of the earth, warm air rises, and it essentially creates this rising kind of column of warm air. And if you've ever been out and you've seen a bunch of buzzards or turkey vultures kind of circling over a very specific area, a lot of times they're in a thermal. So they're just hitting that rising column of warm air. They're just locking their wings and kind of going, in circles inside of that thermal. But what this does is it can pull up any scent molecules from the bottom of that slope up to that deer. So now he's got this thermal that's pulling scent up from the bottom of the slope from in front of him, and now he's covered from the back from that dominant wind direction, and now he can just sit up there and kind of keep an eye out too, listen, as well as smell. And so it's a really kind of interesting, it creates like this wind tunnel where the two winds collide, and it just creates this really kind of congruent area that just pulls any scent in from below or from the backside of that slope. And so a deer is very, very protected in a setup like that.
It's like a cheat code for deer, like to give them infinite wind from
Yeah,
infinite directions. They just sit in one spot and collect it from all around. It's makes it tough. It's
absolutely.
tough for hunters out there. We need all the help we can get. Look at that.
Now, this specific kind of bedding example has been my bread and butter probably for the past decade of my public land deer hunting experience. I have found what I consider ridge point bedding. And now I want to clarify, I didn't come up with this idea. The first time I heard about it was from a guy named Dan Ingval. He's a former writer for Realtree Outdoors. I think he's done some stuff on YouTube with the hunting public, but he's also got his own channel called like the Hunting Beast or something. But he used to write about this, a decade or so ago, and it really piqued my interest because it just made complete logical sense. And so I want you to focus a little bit on these contour lines right around where this X is. And so you can see we kind of have, a shape of a point that kind of jets out into this valley or this creek bottom, whatever you want to call it. And what is very common is a buck to bed on the very tip of that ridge point, because again, we have those thermals creating this rising column of warm air that's pulling anything up that slope to him, whether it's directly in front, maybe it's from these kind of little side shoots on the valleys on the side. Now, when he's in a ridge point, he is going to only use this type of bed if the wind direction is completely correct. Because again, he's going to be in that ridge point facing into that valley. So now he can watch over this entire kind of swath of area, look for predators, look for people, look for does, look for other bucks that maybe he wants to scare off because this is his area. But he can only do that if he has that dominant wind coming, from his rear up to his nose. And this kind of creates this identical system with that leeward where he's got kind of this wind tunnel that's pulling any wind from every direction to him, and he can sit up there and just monitor it all. Now, what can be very tricky is how to hunt an area like this, and that's the kind of stuff we're really going to get into part two because of this right here. It's very common, especially on these ridge points, for winds to shift. That can really screw you if let's say you think he's betting over here and you're maybe setting up either on this ridge point, or maybe you're setting up on the back trying to hope that you catch him as he's escaping or trying to sneak out of that bed. But what's very intriguing about these ridge point beds is how consistent they are. I have been able to just look at a map and you can see these two are pretty out in the open, pretty easy to spot. If we were to go to these, chances are you would find evidence of some type of bedding activity being on these ridge points. I have really found it to be that consistent. Now, certainly pressure, and if the habitat's not conducive or if there's just better bedding elsewhere, they may have a different strategy. But I have found this to be fairly accurate across the board. Is one of my favorite spots to find what I consider really mature buck bedding because they have so much sanctuary, they have so much cover, and not to mention they can escape in any single direction here. They can run straight down that slope in front of them, no problem. They can sneak out the back door. They can sneak out a side door. They have just mountains of avenues of how they can escape a bed like that. Because that's something to keep in mind when you're really thinking about these deer beds is how are they accessing that bed, but also how are they leaving it? How are they escaping it? Because that's where we want to set up. I don't necessarily like to set up on the entry to a bed, but if I can find how he's leaving that area, that can put you in a pretty good spot. Now, this next type of bedding, I kind of pulled the satellite image for this specific slide because this is the area I scouted, and we have a lot of videos that we'll see here in a few minutes on. But this is what we consider oxbow bedding, and so you can see we essentially have a river or a body of water that essentially creates this really nice peninsula out into nothing essentially. Bucks really like areas like this. Some people call it a buck nest because it can be that dense with different bucks utilizing that bedding area because again, it gives them protection on all sides. Typically, they're going to want, just like with that ridge point bed, they're going to want that wind screaming across their back. He's going to be out on the edge of that oxbow, largely facing out, and he wants the wind coming from basically that part of the oxbow that connects to the mainland. He wants to be able to smell anything that's trying to sneak into an oxbow. Now, what's really difficult about oxbow bedding is just think about how you can try to access that. It's very difficult, especially if the wind is coming directly from the mainland, just ripping down that oxbow. He's going to smell you before you even get half mile, quarter mile away from him. He's already onto you. He's alert, and he's probably already sneaked out the back door without you ever knowing it. So in areas like this, if you can utilize water to access, it can be your best bet. Whether that's a kayak, the area I'll show you that we scouted when we get to it here in a few minutes, I plan on accessing with waders. It's a fairly low river that I can wade across, and I'm going to bring in waders, wade across it, so that I can get in there quick, quiet, without ever letting them know I'm there.
Yeah, and that's important to point out. It's not just go by water because it makes the travel easier. If that happens, great. But even if it makes the travel more difficult, a lot of times that's the way to do it because the reason the buck is bedded there is because nobody can get there without him knowing. So, I mean, forget about hunting it in the evening time completely. In the morning, you better get there early, but still, coming in the water is going to be your best bet.
Absolutely. And
They're
one
not
thing
expecting that. You got to trick them.
you do, you really do. It becomes this kind of chess game, and that's what I find so appealing about, hunting big tracts of public land. And I should also mention with oxbow and with a lot of these, kind of concepts we've hit on, if it's a mature buck using that specific bedding area, you may only get a handful of opportunities to harvest that deer before he's onto you. He's aware of your presence, and he starts to shift his patterns a little bit. And so a lot of what I do when I and we'll talk about this more in depth in a few minutes, but a lot of what I do is try to think about how I can access a property, when I want to be in that state, when do I think that area is conducive for a hunt. A lot of what we'll talk about in the kind of the latter half of this webinar on this oxbow that I plan on hunting this year, I plan on literally hunting that maybe 2 or 3 times this entire season. And that's largely going to be that kind of pre-rut to rut period when the wind is correct. And unfortunately, the oxbow I'll be hunting has it needs a wind direction that we don't quite frequently get in Illinois. And so I just know offhand that I'm only going to be able to hunt it a handful of times. But again, that also keeps your scent out there. If you're hitting the same stand day after day after day, they start to pick up on it. You start to leave a lot of scent in the area. It starts to just kind of scent up where there's just kind of human scent all around the area. They really, really start to pick up on that. Now, one thing I focus a lot on is looking at tracks. Tracks, I think so many people just walk, oh, there's a deer track there, there's a deer track there. Oh, tracks can tell you a lot about a deer that made that specific track. It can tell you if it's running, it can tell you if it's walking, it can tell you if it's an older deer or a younger deer, it can tell you if it's a buck or if it's a doe. But even more important, it can tell you directionality of the travel. And I think a lot of people just look at tracks and go, oh, there's deer trail here, he's using this. But what direction is he going? Is he, and if you now know bedding and you start to find tracks that are going away from the bedding and you can pinpoint, hey, that looks like an older deer, that's a big track, it looks like a buck track, you can really start to paint a picture of, hey, I might have found this transition from where this buck goes from bed to feed or from bed to check on does. And so tracks can tell you a lot about deer. So take time when you're out there to actually look at the track up close. Look at how splayed out are those kind of deer hooves on the front. Are they completely splayed out, which indicates an older deer? Are they a lot closer together and kind of pointed, which indicates a young deer? Now, one caveat I do want to kind of emphasize is if you see in this picture down below, you can see these two dots behind what most people would call a deer track. A lot of people would just instantly call that a buck track because of those two dots. I do want to say does can make that as well. A lot of it depends on the weight of that animal, but even more so on the condition of the ground. If it's a very soft ground and a deer's foot will just sink really deep, you'll get these other indentations behind that kind of main track. So don't necessarily just look at those two dots and go, oh, buck track. You need to look a little bit closer.
We'll say one cool thing with tracks, we're going to see a divergence here at some point because right now, bucks and does are both on bed to feed pattern. That's what they're worried about. And once we get into the pre-rut, does are mostly going to be on that same bed to feed pattern, and bucks are going to start to be on scrape to scrape pattern. And so there's going to be a little divergence in tracks. And if you look carefully, some of the small deer trails start to be used and get used frequently. And if you follow those, maybe it goes scrape to scrape to scrape, often with rubs in between. Now you're on a travel corridor of a buck. So if that's what you want to hunt, that's a great place to be because these spots often get overlooked by most other hunters because it's not the biggest trail in the woods. It's not going to be the trail that looks like the cattle path, that's beat down. It's just a small little trail. You're like, is that a raccoon trail, a rabbit trail? No, that could be a big buck trail. He's not using it as much as the 12 does use the cattle trail.
Good point. Good point. And since Curtis brought up rub, I think this is a perfect transition. I do want to emphasize I'm not, especially this time of year, looking for rubs. But what rubs can really tell you is, especially if you find a lot of old rubs, what it tells me right off the bat is, hey, some kind of buck is using this area. Even if that buck has been harvested the year prior or 2 years prior, chances are, if that area is what a buck considers bucky, so it's a reason he's living there, chances are another buck's going to move in rather quickly. And so don't just think about rubs as looking, because we'll start to see rubs in mid-October. You'll start to see the first few, and then as you get closer to Halloween, it's going to explode, and you'll see them literally everywhere out there if you're in a good area where bucks are kind of using it. But pay attention to those old rubs too. They can give you just as much information as a new rub can, especially if you're, doing this preseason scouting. So pay special attention to rubs. Now, I do want to just kind of quickly mention there's a lot of myths about rubs that kind of occur on the interwebs, for lack of a better term. One of the big ones is why deer make rubs. You'll hear everything from training their necks to fighting to practicing fighting, but in reality, these are communication tools. So at the base of a deer's antler, he has a scent gland. And what he's doing is he's basically marking that tree with that scent gland and saying, hey, this is my territory. And what's very common is you're going to find what we consider a rub line. If you are ever out there and you find a fresh rub that looks like it was made within the past, couple days, week maybe, do a 360. Just completely stand at that rub and just spin around. Chances are you're going to see another rub, walk to it, do the same thing, and another and another and another. And eventually you'll find this entire rub line, and you'll start to really be able to pinpoint that buck's movement as he's making and working that rub line. Now, rubs attract hunters. I will say that if there's a rub that's very easy to see from an area that a lot of hunters walk, chances are you're not the only person to see that rub. So just kind of keep that in mind a little bit, especially if you're on public land, is that a lot of hunters are looking for rubs. It's a great sign. It's active sign. But I don't personally hunt over rubs. There are some people who will find a rub line and will sit right on top of that rub line and wait for that buck to come and what we call work that rub line, where he'll make new rubs each day to kind of mark it with that scent. The vast majority of, there was actually a study, I think it was out of the Georgia Deer Lab, or no, it was out of Mississippi, where they had a bunch of mature bucks collared, GPS collared, and they actually basically time checked it when they're checking these rubs. It was something like 80 to 90% of checking rubs and checking scrapes occurs during nocturnal hours. So that's outside of legal shooting light. So it occurs in the dark. And so I don't necessarily want to put all my eggs in that basket just because I know how often deer are checking those areas during darkness. I'd rather set myself up for a little bit more success. But really good intel, really good information for both rubs and scrapes. But again, personally, I'm not sitting over top of them. I know a ton of people have. I know a ton of people have success over it. It can be very good in the right instances. But for me, especially on the pressured public land that I hunt, I have found that it's even my trail camera pictures. If I'll put a trail cam on a rub line, virtually 100% of those buck pictures are all going to be at night. So I want to try to find where they're daylight active. Now, scrape is kind of
Sure. Another thing with them being so showy, I'm hesitant to put a camera on a rub line because like you said, so
sure.
many people see it. It's almost like a flag saying,
Yeah, it's
"Hey,
like a
come check
beacon
out
out
my
there.
camera." And more are gonna be coming. You come back and all of a sudden the two trees right next to your camera's rubbed and you're like, "Oh man." So just keep that in mind. They're
Yep,
showy.
that's a
It's
good point.
good. I always mark it if you use Onyx or Hunt Stand, which are both partners of the program. We support them, but mark it on there. Use that information, but no, I'm not hunting there. Over a scrape occasionally, but even most scrape activity is nocturnal. It's
Yeah.
not quite as nocturnal as rub, which is but still probably like 70% of scrape activity is nocturnal, but great things to mark and know where they are.
Absolutely, because what it tells me when I find a scrape or rubs, it tells me I'm in that buck's what I consider his bedroom. I'm in his core range. I'm in his core area that he thinks is his turf. That's where I want to be. I want to be somewhere in there on a transition from a bed to a. We'll kind of get into more of that here in a few minutes, but I want to be in that buck bedroom, and finding rubs and scrapes is a great indication that you're in there. So these scrapes are essentially areas on the ground where a deer is going to rake all the vegetation away. He'll scratch it up, and if it's very fresh, you'll even see hoof marks in it from where they're dragging their feet. Now, if you look closely at this picture, it's really hard to show this in a picture, but if you look about 4 feet above that scrape, you'll find a little horizontal branch that comes across. And 95% of the times you find a scrape, you're going to see that. And 90% of the times you see that, there's going to be a little twig that's kind of broke and is dangling off. We kind of call this whole twig a licking branch. And so while a deer is in there scraping and scraping away all that vegetation, he's going to be working his antlers using that same gland that he does to rub trees to mark up that licking branch. He's also going to lick it and chew on it a little bit, again, depositing more scent, because this is a communication tool. That's the whole purpose of a scrape. Now, what he's going to do after he creates a scrape, and he's typically going to do this every 24 to 48 hours after making one, he's going to mark the scrape. Now, how he does this is on the inside of his legs, his back legs, he's got two huge glands, basically right at the knee joint. Now he's going to put his legs together as he's standing in that scrape. He's going to urinate down his legs, which that urine is then going to hit those scent glands, pick up a little bit of those pheromones and hormones, and deposit it on the ground right inside that scrape. And so that's how he's marking that scrape. And essentially what he's doing is he's saying, hey, I'm here, I'm ready to breed. He's going to continue to do this 24 to 48 hours. He's going to usually recheck and refreshen up these scrapes. Now, his hope is that he will then come across his scrape and, oh, a doe visited it who's now in heat, and she deposits her scent, and now he can begin chasing her. So it's kind of this signpost that says, hey, I'm ready to breed. But what, if you think kind of critically, what that tells you is he's doing this in an area where he expects does to frequent. He doesn't want to do this in an area that a doe's not going to walk by. The whole point of it is that he wants a doe that's in heat, is ready to breed, to come across it, go, oh, I'm ready to breed too, deposit her scent, and then he's going to, after he checks it in those 24 to 48 hours, he'll begin scent checking, and that's when he's going to take off and try to start chasing and finding where she is. So look not only at just, oh, there's a scrape there. Think about what that scrape tells you. One, it tells you you're in a buck's bed, you're in a buck bedroom, but it also tells you there's probably some really frequent doe travel corridors in this immediate area if he's doing it right here, because he wants does to smell it, he wants does to see it, and he wants does to visit it. This is a sign you'll come across a lot. We just kind of wanted to throw up a couple pictures. This is your standard deer scat, but I do want to talk a little bit about why it looks so different. You can see we have one that's very clumpy at the top. We have one that's very individual pellets. That can tell you a lot about the diet of a deer. The top picture where they're kind of all clumped together, that's going to be a very heavy fiber diet. So it can be fruit, it can be things that are not that are things that are just more high in fiber. Essentially, you won't see that a lot in the fall, especially because a lot of our fruit bearing stuff is kind of going right now. There are some that you may find a little bit later, but typically when we see these droppings at the bottom, that tells me they're eating a lot of acorns. And we'll talk why I think acorns are so important in a little bit, but just kind of keep those in mind. Essentially, you have a high fiber diet, a low fiber diet, and it can tell you kind of what they're munching on a little bit. And obviously, trails are king for every deer hunter, but like Curtis said earlier, don't focus on just those trails that look like a highway cattle has come through. Every other hunter has seen them. Now, you may get a lot of traffic on that, but I have found a lot of those areas that look like it's just beat down and it's kind of bare ground. A lot of those I have found to be very nocturnal travel routes, especially if they're consistently using them that much, that much, that much. They may be a nocturnal. So I like to find these trails that kind of branch off of a main trail. So if you have a really nice main trail that comes together and then it splits into two or three, I like to try to sit right at that confluence of different trails coming together, just to increase your odds a little bit.
For
So
sure. And we should point out that's a public land tactic. If
yes,
you have private land, then by all means, you might have a lot more incentive to sit on the really showy sign because you know nobody else is going to be there. One thing about public land, you got a lot of area to walk around on, which I know Dan and I both like. It's great when you get used to hunting public land. You almost don't want to go hunt private, even if it's a good spot, because oh, you just go to the stand. Like I don't
Yeah,
have
oh,
to
I've
look
got
at a
50
map
acres.
and find a place to go. You
Yeah.
know, it lacks. Not saying that it's bad. I would, if anybody wants to give me permission, I'll still take it. But public land does have some added challenges, and that's really what Dan's talking about. But if you have a private spot that's got a cattle trail looking deer trail going through it, by all means, that might be the spot you want to set up.
Absolutely. And while we're talking about trails, I'll give kind of one of my, I don't know, call it scouting pro tip from Dan. When I get to a brand new area that I've never hunted before and I find a nice looking deer trail, whether you use Onyx, you use Hunt Stand, you use Google Maps, you use Apple Maps, a lot of these have ways to record your path. And I have found it to be so advantageous to just pick up a deer trail, start recording where I'm walking, and follow that trail till it ends. You're going to start to, especially if you do that a lot on a very specific piece of land, you're going to start to get this kind of mosaic map of different trails and where they converge, where they confluence. And it can be really helpful to your hunt planning process. So that's one of my greatest kind of first steps when I get to a new area that I really haven't done any scouting. I don't know anything about. I haven't spent a ton of time looking at maps. I'm just going to hop on a trail, walk down that trail till it ends and see where it goes and kind of mark it on a map as best as I can, because you'll start to, what I have found to be so true is you'll follow a trail and you'll go, oh, that was a nice trail, and then you'll get on another trail, you'll walk it. You may not even realize that at one point in those trails they were only 5 feet apart from each other. But if you were just walking, not paying attention, it's very easy to get turned around in the woods to where everything looks new, everything looks, you can't really have a good reference point. And you may find an area doing a strategy where you're mapping out some of these deer trails. You may find an area where three trails all come within 20 or 30 yards of each other, and hey, that's bow range. If you can find an area with that many trails inside of bow range, game over. That's where you should sit. And so figuring out where these trails are, but also how they interact with each other, how they meander, because deer are what I like to consider fairly lazy. They're like us. They take the path of least resistance. Once they find an area that's a good path, that's safe, that's easy, they're going to continue to use it over and over and over. But now we'll get to a little bit of kind of the real scouting here. So this is the area I'm looking to hunt. I do want to clarify this is not the exact area because we didn't really want to highlight too many different spots on public land, but this is a perfect example. It basically looks the exact same, just slightly different. But when I'm first looking at a map like this, I'm thinking about all those those potential bedding locations that we just talked about. So I'm looking at ridge points. I'm looking at, do I have any very strong north or south facing slopes, which in this one, you can see these contour lines are quite far apart. So you don't have a ton of topography here to work with, but you do have some really nice ridge points, and you've got a little bit of an oxbow that's kind of jetting out over here on kind of the left portion that we'll kind of highlight there. So you can see we've got where these blue X's are. These are some decent looking, what I would consider ridge point bedding locations. When I got there, I would go check those out. I would look at those and say, hey, does this habitat look right? Is it too thick? Is it too thin to where he's going to be wide in the open? Is there evidence of bedding there, or is there evidence of travel? So I'm looking for trails. I'm looking for old rubs. I'm looking for an indentation where a deer has been laying. But when I first looked at this map, outside of these ridge points, the first thing that caught my eye was this big kind of oxbow peninsula that's kind of cut off from the rest of it. Now, obviously, there is some timber on the other side, but there's water there. There is a physical terrain that they feel protected by. A lot of their predators, us humans, we don't like to cross water. We are, like we said earlier, lazy. We're going to take the path of least resistance. They know that. And so an oxbow is a great spot to think about as kind of a buck bedding location. Now, what we did find, and this is very common, is kind of these old fields. Now, this picture is a little bit older. This is basically a giant prairie now. So there's, 6 foot tall grasses that will be out there in the fall. Right now, it's probably, 3 or 4 feet. I could just kind of get my arms above it last time we were walking through, but full of doe beds. And if you think back to our earlier conversations about how they differ between a buck bedding location and doe bedding location, does are bedding in family groups. They rely on that concept of more numbers, lots of noses, lots of eyes. They can bed out in a prairie like that and have no problem with it. We found beds everywhere. We probably kicked up 4 or 5 does as we were walking through there. And again, that's why I'm so adamant about doing this in the preseason. I would not ever, ever, ever walk through a bedding area like that during hunting season. Um, just not something I do. I don't want to disturb the deer in the area. I don't want them to, you're basically making it harder on yourself if you start to educate the deer that you're hunting them in that specific area. So we found a ton of doe bedding just on the outside of what I consider a really solid buck bedding location. And now what's really important about that is to think about the relationship between a doe bedding and rut. So during rut, pre-rut, so let's say I like to start thinking about rut end of October. My favorite day to hunt in the deer woods is October 31st. So Halloween, I found it to be about the best day you could ever ask for because they are not completely rutted up yet. When you hit peak rut, that's when a buck is going to be off tending a doe or breeding a doe. He may be with that individual doe for 24 to 36 hours. That starts to reduce the number of deer that are active on the landscape, especially because rut is triggered by the amount of daylight. And so they usually all hit at about the exact same time. And so I have found this pre-rut time to be extremely advantageous. That's when the buck's testosterone levels are starting to increase. They're about to peak. They usually peak in kind of that first couple days of November. They're going to start what we call scent checking does. In addition to working scrapes like we talked about earlier, he's going to be getting on the downwind side. Keep that in mind, the downwind side of that bedding area, and he's just going to skirt it. All he has to do is walk on the downwind side of that bedding area. He can quickly walk by that bedding area, scent check to see if any single doe in that entire bedding area is in estrus or is in heat, meaning she's ready to breed. If not, he's going to go on his way and go check another doe bedding area. If he is, that's usually when he's going to cut in and start chasing her pretty much all around the countryside until she gives in and is ready to be bred. But having a buck bed, a potential buck bedding location this close to a doe bedding area is pretty ideal. And so
Like
here are
it
some.
sounds so romantic, Dan.
Does but as we kind of scouted a little bit more of this doe bed, we found some very prominent doe travel routes kind of exiting this field. And what we really found was after they get to about kind of where the T is in doe travel routes, they start to diverge a little bit. And that's where we think they're really starting to feed. A lot of these ridges and bottoms are just full of oak trees. So acorns are going to be just abundant as fall comes in. They'll start dropping acorns, mid-October. You'll start to really see acorns everywhere in early November. That's what the deer are largely going to shift to once the crops come out of the ground. Right now, what I think is you can see we have all this big ag on the western side of this map here. I think right now a lot of those deer are feeding in those areas. We find a lot of evidence where they're crossing the creek and crossing the river to go up to those ag fields and feed. But once those ags start to get stripped out, I think it's going to pull all the deer back into that primary doe bedding location, and they're going to start using these old travel routes that are pretty prominent, but we could tell they haven't been used a ton this summer. And again, I think that's because they're skewing to feed in that ag. So we confirmed a lot of buck beds by just being out there. And my immediate thought, anytime I get to an area that I think is worthwhile hunting, I take notes. I know it may sound, a little bizarre to some people, but I actually carry a notebook in my pocket when I'm out scouting and I jot down notes. One of the big things I jot down is what do I need to hunt this specific spot? Now, this specific spot, this kind of oxbow, again, I only plan on hunting it 2 or 3 times when the weather's right, when the wind is right, and when we're kind of in that pre-rut period where I think a buck is going to be bedding there because it's so close proximity to that doe bedding area. So I like to take notes, think about what you need in that area to hunt. How are you going to access it? And again, what to expect. So is this going to be an early season hunt? If I just want to get a doe for the freezer, I can tell you right now, there's a little cross basically right between these green and yellow blobs that are indicating the doe bed and the buck bed. There's a perfect doe crossing area where you can see they're going kind of all the way completely around into these ag fields. That would be an ideal early season hunt. Use that information to your advantage. Even if you're just wanting to get a deer for the freezer, think about where they're bedding and where they're feeding. That is really it. Deer hunting is really that simple if you just want to put meat in the freezer. Where are they bedding? Where are they feeding? How are they getting between the two? And here we have their bedding. We found evidence of it everywhere. We know they're feeding these ag fields just because it's there. It's good for them. They like it. Illinois is a virtual buffet for deer. Now, when am I going to hunt this? For me, again, pre-rut, but I need a very specific wind direction. I cannot hunt this on a west wind. I may be able to get away with a southwest wind if I was to go on kind of the northern tip of this oxbow. I could probably get away with that, but what I plan on doing is waiting for a wind that's, I mean, 100% crystal clear coming out of the east to the west, and I want to be on the very tip of that oxbow. That way all my scent is leaving that oxbow. I don't want any of my scent lingering in there. And this is the area, like I mentioned, I'm going to have to access with some waders. If the water levels allow it, I might take a kayak. It might be easier to access this way, but again, this is only for a 2 or 3 day hunt. But I think you can use a lot of these concepts just in your standard hunt planning process. So I'm going to play a quick video that kind of shows a few of our trail camera sets in this specific oxbow. I do want to mention a few things right up front. First, you do not have to use trail cameras. I hunted for, this is honestly my second or third year using trail cameras heavily in my hunt planning strategies. Historically, it's been, I'll go out, find the sign. I may run a trail camera for a week or two just to see which directionality they're coming from. But this year I'm using a little bit more. And one thing I'm really trying to do is find, if I can get the same buck on camera at one point and then 10 minutes later down that trail at another camera, now I've got a really good pinpoint of how he's getting to areas. And if you look at this still image right now, this is that prairie that's out front of that oxbow. You can see it's about 5-ish feet tall now. It's still rather green. Deer beds everywhere. If you find an area like this, especially if it's a secluded area, so this is again in a bottomland, it's probably a half mile from the nearest parking lot at the public land site, so it's fairly secluded. So I'll kind of quick play this video just so you get an idea of what the terrain looks like out there, and you can see, you know, kind of how we set up some trail cameras to see what's coming through these areas.
So today we're gonna be working our way out this peninsula here that has a river that runs through it. This is very, very dense woods that is met with this huge bedding area, and there's just beds and things all throughout here. So we have this crazy bedding area mixed with this more secluded bedding area, food all around us. So yeah, I mean, what we're gonna do is, because it's so thick, we're just gonna walk along the edge of where the bigger timber starts up, and we're gonna try to see if we can find deer trails and just follow deer trails and wait for them to spread out. And as soon as they start forking off, we'll put cameras where we see all those intersections where there's some high traffic areas. So that's how we'll narrow down going through that thick stuff, trying to figure out where to put a camera at. So check it out, man.
I apologize for the wind noise. That's the only video that we're out in the open. The others are a little bit better. But I do want to kind of emphasize what Jason really highlighted there is how did we start scouting this area? Like he said, we walked what I call a very hard edge. And so deer are, in fact, most game species are what we consider edge species. So they like this intersection between two habitat types. In this specific instance, it happens to be mature forest to prairie grasses. So right at that hard edge, you have more species diversity, you have a higher abundance of plant life just in general, and deer largely utilize these kind of edges to just kind of traverse the area. They don't like to go out in the open. So what we're doing is basically we get on that hard edge and we just walk it until we see, and we actually did walk the entire thing and then came back because we wanted to make sure we didn't miss a really solid trail. because what we wanted to do at this point was to find that access. Because again, we know the does are going through that oxbow right now to get to the ag, to get to the feeding areas, the corn and the soybeans that are up on the western portion. So we knew right now those does are going through there. So we want to find that main travel corridor that all the deer are using. And so we walked up and down that edge until we found what we decided was the heaviest trail. And then all we did was basically hop into that trail and start looking for an area where one trail turns into 3 or 4. And that's where we want to put our camera. Or if you just want to go ahead and set up, that's where you want to set up. So we've got another one. This will kind of show you that confluence of trails a little bit that we found just basically 20 yards inside of that hard edge. You have one main trail coming in, and then it just starts to veer off in every single direction. And so for this camera set, we have a real popular doe bedding field just kind of in front of us a little bit. And there's this nice trail that comes right into this little oxbow. And what's really intriguing is the area we're putting this camera, you actually have kind of a divergence of trails. So we've got a trail coming off in this direction and a trail coming off this direction. So we're going to try to point the camera about right here so that we can get anything traveling down either of these trails. And so what we're looking at here, we have the camera set up. Now, this camera is in an area where we do expect other hunters to walk by. So we did keep it in the brush a little bit. So we're probably going to get quite a few pictures of this vegetation and such moving in the wind in front of it. But again, we really wanted to make sure that camera's still here when we come back to get it. But this area that we found, we've got a really nice trail that comes directly off of this old prairie field, which is basically a huge doe bedding area. We were in it this morning, found a ton of doe beds, and it basically leads directly down this trail where it then splits off into 2 trails. And so we have the camera positioned in that spot right at the confluence of those trails, hoping to catch anything coming off this bedding area, or later in the year as bucks start to check these doe bedding areas. This is probably a route he's going to use quite a bit.
So now, all right, so now we've followed that trail down farther. What we're doing right now is we're going off that large, tall grass field that has a lot of the beds in it, and we're working our way down a peninsula. We're surrounded by a river on this public land site here, and there's a narrow peninsula that kind of comes out that's wooded, and we think it's a decent spot for some buck bedding. It's going to be a really hard spot to hunt. We're going to have to wait specifically for probably an east wind day, so that way they can't smell us coming in here. But it's going to be a really nice spot. We think it's going to be a really good sanctuary for deer, especially when hunting season kicks off. But so basically we're just working our way down that same deer trail, and we saw a bunch of different trails leading off of it that didn't look as worn. And so we're just working our way down what we thought was the main trail. And now we've come to another section of trails here. We're going to put up another camera and see if they're using this area any different than the one we have already down a little bit farther. We do have some, here's Dan putting up the camera. But we do have some grass and some bedding area up in here. I mean, all this could be bedding. I mean, it's just this dense wooded peninsula with some grass and stuff mixed in. And depending on which way the wind's blowing, this would be a perfect spot to hang out for a deer because they'll smell you coming.
Got another nice bed. And we go a little bit further, there's more and more beds scattered all throughout here. So I saw we had a question. I kind of addressed that because I think that's a fantastic question. And it essentially was, if you weren't using cameras, what was your strategy in an area like this? So my strategy, I'll kind of go back to some maps a little bit to help kind of explain what my strategy would be. So we'll kind of use this one because it's a little bit cleaner here. So what I do a lot of this, even if I'm running trail cameras, which again is a fairly new concept for me. I do a lot of what I will call a reconnaissance hunt or a scouting hunt. So we're talking in season. So after October 1st, I've got all my hunting gear with me. I'm going to get in an area where I don't necessarily expect to be able to harvest a deer, but my sole purpose for that specific hunt is to monitor and watch how deer are utilizing a specific area. And so, for instance, in an area like this, I would try to get a relatively high point in this field, whether you want to climb a tree with a tree stand or you just want to try to find maybe a little natural kind of high here. And I would literally sit and watch this entire field. I would watch it either an entire evening or an entire morning, and I'm going to visually watch how deer are moving through that area. And largely it can be a lot more beneficial than trail cameras, because one thing everyone thinks, oh, I had my camera here, it didn't see a single deer. Well, every deer could have walked right behind the tree and you would have never known it. So don't rely solely on cameras. But to go back to your question, that's how I would hunt an area like this. You could either be super, what I would call aggressive, and just get in that oxbow, maybe where, we found those areas of confluences of trails. You could get in there and just go big or go home. But what I would recommend is being a little bit more cautious, sitting on the outskirts, and just kind of visually watching how deer are moving through an area. But if I was being super aggressive, I would just hop in there, get in a tree, and see what happens. Because unfortunately, in an area like this, and I think you could kind of see it in some of that video, it is so thick that you could not hunt from the ground. And I don't know if everybody's listened to our podcast, or taken some of our learn to hunt workshops, or taken a few of our webinars in the past. But if you have, you'll know I'm largely a ground hunter for a lot of my life. I enjoy being on the ground with my bow. I find it to be challenging, but it allows me to hunt in a lot of places that other people cannot hunt, because there's a big cohort of people out there that will not deer hunt without a tree stand. And if there's not a suitable tree in an area, they just immediately close off and kind of lock that off. Now, in this specific area, it would be very difficult, next to impossible, to be able to sit in there on the ground and be unnoticeable, and be able to actually get a clean shot through some of that vegetation. But it could certainly be done if you find the right specific area. But again, if I'm not using trail cameras, I'm going to do what I consider a reconnaissance hunt, and I'm just going to sit back and try to observe and watch what the deer are doing naturally. And then the next night, deer are creatures of habit. If nothing disturbs them, and if nothing largely changes, they're going to do the same thing again. So if you see deer using a certain portion of that field the night before, go sit on that portion the next night. And if you put 3 or 4 sits back to back to back to back over an area like that, you can largely get very successful. So that would be my rec. And so for this camera set, we
There's
have,
a lot of people that scout without cameras.
absolutely, yeah. Like I said, I just started using them.
And I mean, I would definitely recommend using one of the mapping apps. I use HuntStand. I know Dan uses OnX, but it just helps you keep track of that stuff so much better. Every time you find a rub, a scrape, you can mark it. A bed, you can mark it. You've got different icons, so you can quickly find these things. You can run trails, make
And
them
it,
all different
again, it
colors.
really references how things lay together too. That is such an important aspect of deer hunting, that if you have no spatial awareness of, oh, there was a bed somewhere over there, there was another trail was on somewhere over there, but if you can come back, like Curtis said, on your OnX or HuntStand, and pull it up on your big screen and be able to see all these different things right next to you, you can really start to pinpoint exactly what those deer are doing.
For sure. Even if you don't know a thing about deer, you just go out to the woods and find edges and walk edges. Look for trails, look for sign. You find trails, walk the trail, mark it. If you just mark everything you find and then you go back home and look at it, after a couple trips, it's going to start to look like a road map. Oh,
Absolutely.
look, all these trails go to here. This must be a great bedding locate. All these trails go to here. It's a white oak flat where they're feeding on acorns. Like, it'll start to make sense just from going out there and walking around. So you don't need cameras to do any of that, but cameras are fun because every time you run cameras, it's kind of like Christmas. You don't know what you're gonna have, you know?
Yes.
It's like right, Forrest Gump's mama, box of chocolates. You know, don't know what you're gonna get. You never know. Is it a mountain lion? Is it a bobcat? Is it a Sasquatch? Is it other hunters? Is it a giant buck? You never know.
Yep. And for me, like I said, I'm fairly new to the trail camera game. I personally do not plan on running trail cameras. Once October 1 starts, I'm done with the cameras. Right now it's just figure out what's using an area, and B, what directionality and when, because this is a brand new area to me, and I know there's some really big mature bucks in this area, and I'm probably only going to get, like I said, 1 or 2 shots at it before I kind of bungle that area up with scent, or with disturbing. And so I really need to be kind of hyper focused and very very systematic about my approach. But I just kind of wanted to show some of these pictures. So these four right here are from that first camera we set. I literally let that camera sit in that oxbow for 5 days, went out and pulled it, and you can see we already have multiple bucks utilizing this area. And for me, that's largely enough information. I now know that bucks are traveling this route. I know that bucks are commonly using it, but trail cameras are certainly fun. Now, what I really want to show with this kind of the next clip and as well as this slide, sorry, it's not the best. I had to really zoom in to kind of pinpoint it a little bit. But if you look on this oxbow, if you look very closely, you'll kind of see little clumps of trees, right? Now, these are almost like islands, for lack of a better term. It's almost all grassland and just some pockets of these trees. Every single island or pocket of trees that we went and looked at had evidence of a buck bed in it. One of them was relatively fresh. I wouldn't be surprised if we didn't bump that buck out that morning when we went in scouting. Some others had old rubs from last year that you could tell, nothing's really been using it commonly, but there was just buck bed after buck bed and all of these little islands of vegetation in there, because it's largely grassland and then there's just little thickets, for lack of a better term, but they have kind of these overall woody vegetative structure that bucks really like to bed in. So this
Now, do
next
you
clip,
still have cameras back in there?
yes, I still have three in there. I actually went ahead and pulled two of them, but
Nice.
still have three running in there. Yeah.
Okay, so for part two, we're gonna get to see what else came through. I'm just
Absolutely.
as excited as everybody else. Gonna have
And
to
see,
tune
that's the
in
whole
to.
fun of it. Like I know, like we've mentioned, deer are seasonal. I know chances are if I do shoot a buck back in there, it's probably going to end up being a buck I've never seen before. I never got a picture of, because that's how it always happens. You'll spend all this time on looking at what bucks are there, and then a buck that was nowhere to be seen just automatically shows up during a rut and walks down the trail you're sitting on. But yeah, so this is me kind of sitting at one of these quote unquote islands of kind of timber inside this oxbow. So for this camera, we actually found a nice little buck bed. It's got quite a bit of sign in it, both scat and a bunch of fresh tracks, so something's using it quite regularly. And it's interesting, we're actually on this giant oxbow, and so the river is pretty much all surrounding us in every direction, so this buck can really use this as a nice secluded area. So we found this nice buck bedding area. You can see it's pretty much surrounded by vegetation on all sides with kind of one main escape route. But that buck can obviously escape in multiple directions if he needs to, but he's using this kind of one primary trail coming out of here. We've got quite a few fresh tracks coming right out of this bedding area. They're probably a week old or so, a couple days old. Been a while since we've had rain, so hard to definitively tell how old these are, but we've got this really nice escape route coming directly out of this buck bed, and we've got a camera right there watching this trail.
Yeah, it should be nice. Because not only there's the buck bed trail there, but there's also more trails going that way. So it's just a constant network of trails in here that we're going to see something hopefully.
And so kind of like I highlighted earlier, I don't plan on running these cameras after once deer season starts. I'm pulling them all and putting them back in the closet, and largely that's because I don't want to have a reason to go in there. When I find an area like this where there's active buck bedding, where there's several, we probably found a dozen different buck bedding locations in this little oxbow. I want no reason to go back in there, so I don't want to have to, oh, it's October 15th, I need to go check my cameras. I'll wander out there and stir the place up. I'm done with it once. And honestly, I'll probably pull these mid-September and just be done with them at that point. But what I really want to emphasize with this is thinking about a buck bed and thinking about how he's leaving that bed. That is extremely important if you're really focused on trying to get a mature buck in kind of this pre-rut time frame. If you can pinpoint how he's coming out of his bed and where he's going next, and we basically just figure that out. So right behind Jason, who's standing in this kind of still shot there, is that main trail that went all the way out to that doe bedding area. So my guess is he's leaving that bed, walking up that main trail. He'll start to scent check that doe bedding area, and then he'll go about his way after that. And that's where I'm going to probably try to set up, is on the downwind side of that bedding area, where I expect him to get out of his bed. But again, I have to think about all these other bedding locations he may be in, because I don't want to disturb him when I try to sneak in there early in the morning or, something like that. So we've got one more quick to show and then kind of wrap things up.
So this is the last camera we're going to put up today. We've got kind of a unique spot again, just to kind of give reference of where we are. We have the river just basically on the other side of these trees is a big river with a bluff that drops probably 20 or 30 feet or so, but there's quite a few trails coming up where you could see deer are crossing that river. And right out in front of us is actually that big doe bedding area where we kind of started the day. So there's a lot of just doe frequenting that area, and we envision a lot of this kind of oxbow area directly behind us is going to be a lot of buck bedding. And so we're putting a camera right here on kind of the transition. We've got a little bit of a forest opening. A lot of this stuff back in here is so thick that it's really hard to get a good camera placement, but we found this kind of transition area between what we anticipate is buck bedding behind us and the doe bedding in front of us, and hopefully we catch bucks kind of, cruising up and down this trail as they start to search for does as, rut kicks in October. But right now we're just kind of hoping to see what travels this on kind of a frequent basis. I anticipate it's going to be a lot of does, maybe a couple young bucks. And then as we get closer and closer to fall, I anticipate seeing less does and probably more mature bucks on the camera.
So we came out in July. It's warm out right now. So we came out tip early morning. We tried to get here as early as we could, so that way we knew it was gonna be a long walk in. It's getting hot already. So it's nice to have water with you and also a friend with you. And not just for safety, but just to laugh at each other, to think how stupid you are for doing this in the first place. So that's what we've been doing as we've been crawling through this thick stuff. So it's getting toasty out here in these rhinos, but we're gonna be heading back to the car now. So it looks like it was a good spot, though. It's gonna be interesting to see what we get on these.
And one other thing, while we're kind of talking about it, that I always like to bring with me when I'm hanging cameras is just a climbing stick. It doesn't need to be any brand specific, any cheap one to work. But it's nice to be able to, if you're in areas that you expect more hunting pressure or more people to be walking through, to be able to climb up a little bit and have that camera, in the tree about that high and angled down. That way, most hunters aren't looking up, right? We're always looking down, looking at the ground, looking for tracks and sign. And so being able to elevate that camera can make sure that you don't have too many theft issues. So always a good idea to pack at least one climbing stick with you.
And so essentially the sole reason that we put out this camera, I'll kind of go back to that screenshot. Here we go. So that first camera we put was a little bit further south. And what we found, and this X should be a little bit closer to that kind of north bank of the river there. What we found was what I would probably consider a back door. It really looked like a trail that a buck is going to use in rut. And I know that that's kind of hard to quantify, but it really just has that look. It's extremely secluded. It's not a trail that a deer can run down. It is very thick. It's got to crawl under things. It's got to crawl over things. And if you've ever watched a mature buck, I'll tell you, for instance, this buck back here, I had that deer within 70 yards for about an hour and a half. It took him literally 45 minutes to walk 20 yards. When they are methodical, they are slow, they are quiet, they are careful. And that's the kind of trail that it looked like on the back door to me, is this trail that a buck is going to take 2 steps and he'll sit there for a minute or two, just surveying, looking, smelling, listening. Then he'll take another few. Same thing, stop, listen, smell, and another and another. And it's going to take them a long time, but it had that look that, hey, there's fresh deer tracks in here that are fairly large, but this is in it. They're so large it looked like it was a deer running, but we could tell that it was not a running deer just because of the structure of the trail, just because there's so much debris and it's got to do some kind of loops. And it really had that look of just this, what I consider a back door sneaking out of a bedding area, sight unseen. And so that's kind of what we were hoping for on this camera. And when we went to pull it, we found a nice little 8-pointer had been kind of using that as a nice little back door. So scouting works. Cameras can be useful, but for me, they're more fun than anything. I know Curtis, we were texting back and forth. He pulled some of his cameras last week, I think. Didn't get a single, buck picture, but got a ton of other wildlife. And that's what's really cool about trail cameras, is it's not just for deer scouting. You're going to get pictures of things you're like, man, I didn't know there was that many coyotes in the air. I didn't know there was a bobcat out there. I didn't know the foxes. You get all kinds of really cool stuff. And I do want to mention theft a little bit, especially if you're on public land. Now, the vast majority of these cameras are locked. There's one that's not because I ran out of locks. So they're locked, so they can't be open, they can't be removed from the tree. But if you kind of listen to that last little nugget of information, that last little clip where we talked about elevating the camera and having it point down, that has been kind of my go-to. Now in this area, we had a lot of trees that were, in the 10-foot tall range. So if you got up too high, you really couldn't see anything because there's this little kind of nice understory because it was fairly open in most places. So we kind of stuck them down low. But I really like to take that climbing stick that allows me to get 3 or 4 feet higher in a tree, point that camera down. Because, like I mentioned, deer hunters, when we're walking around, we're doing this. We're looking at the ground, we're looking for rubs, we're looking for scrapes, we're never looking up. So it can be a really good theft deterrent just by elevating that camera a little bit, getting it out of people's eyes.
Yeah, I will say I put one high because it was in this old field and a little constriction. And so I found this clearing up a little bit high where I could put the camera and I felt like I could get a picture of anything throughout the whole field. And it worked. I got all kinds of pictures of coyotes and turkeys and bunch of does and fawns. So think most everything that came either side of the field tripped the camera. I'll put some of those in the part too.
Nice.
And if it was low, I would have never got the other
Yeah, you're
side
gonna
of the
miss them
field.
all.
I would have maybe got my side of the field, but definitely not the other side, especially the shorter animals like coyotes and turkeys.
Sure. Pretty cool. And now I just want to kind of wrap up with a quick conversation about oak trees. We know whitetails' main food source, especially during hunting season, is going to be acorns. Being able to understand, and obviously this is kind of a portion of the deer scouting webinar that could really be thrown into any of our webinars, whether it's deer hunting 101, blah blah blah. But what we really want to emphasize is when we're out scouting, this is also the kind of stuff we're looking for. We're not just looking for what is the deer sign. We're also what does the landscape look like? What is the vegetation that's there? And so I want to do this really, really quick illustration on how to tell the difference between oak groups. So there are hundreds of different oak species. As hunters, we don't necessarily care, nor do we need to know each species. But if we can break them down into a group, it's going to be extremely beneficial. We'll kind of get to why in a little bit. But the first thing to keep in mind is there's a red oak group of oaks and there's a white oak group of oaks. Now there's a red oak species and a white oak species, so don't get those confused. We're talking about groups of oaks. So if we look at these two leaves, we can tell they're quite different. So the red oaks, which we have here on the left that have the arrow pointing to the leaf, if you look closely at the lobe of those leaves, there's a little kind of hair-like appendage. We call that bristle tipped. All red oak, all species of oak that are in this red oak group have that. Where if you look at the white oak leaf right here on the right-hand side of the screen, you can see these are nice real kind of oval shaped lobes and there's no bristle tip at the end of that lobe. That lets you know that it's a white oak or in the white oak group. Now, where this gets really important is the overall acorn development and also the desired food source of whitetail. So whitetail deer, just like the vast majority of other Illinois wildlife, prefer white oak acorns first. They have a lower tannic acid content, so they're not as bitter. They're more of a sweeter, so they prefer them. Now, the red oaks, again, have a higher tannic acid content. They're not necessarily preferred, but what that tannic acid content allows them to do is to last longer viable on the forest floor. White oaks, they cannot last very long on the forest floor without getting either rotten, getting consumed, or getting buried and eventually germinating. And so typically you'll have a period where you'll notice that all of a sudden you may have been hunting an area and you've seen deer every single night. You've seen a dozen come feed on this one, ridge out front that has a ton of white oaks on it. You're like, I found the spot. And then like a light switch goes and they're just gone. And chances are they're transitioning over to a red oak area because either the white oaks are all consumed or gone or they've started to rot. Now, another important time to keep red oaks in mind, not only just after all the white oaks are consumed, But if you have, let's say, interesting weather for a year, so a red oak acorn, it takes 2 years for an individual acorn to mature, where on the white oak, it takes one. Now, that doesn't mean that red oaks only produce acorns every 2 years. It just means that individual acorn has to go through 2 growing seasons before it's completely mature and before it will drop and can be consumed. Now, the real advantage of that is if we have intermittent weather. Maybe one year we have a really wet season, or we have a very dry season where we just get a terrible white oak acorn crop. It happens once every probably 5 to 7 years. You'll have a year that the growing seasons were just not right, and you just don't have a very good white oak crop. That's when having this information in your back pocket that, hey, I know where some red oak stands are on this property, you will see deer starting to go to those areas, because those acorns have had 2 years to produce. So they've already had one decent growing season, and chances are they're still going to have a decent acorn crop even in years of drought where the white oaks are really going to suffer. And so pay attention. I'm going to flip back to this kind of illustration, but when you're out there scouting, look at leaves. Find areas that have a bunch of leaves of this type, whether it's white oak or red oak. You will find some areas where they're kind of intermixed, but largely you'll find a nice white oak stand. You'll find a nice red oak stand. And if you can start to use that information, just kind of tuck it away in the back of your head as you start to see deer transition from being heavily in one area to now all of a sudden they're gone. Chances are they're switching food sources, and it may be because all those white oaks are done and gone, and they're starting to shift to those less desirable, less palatable red oaks that may still be fairly prominent on the landscape and provide a really good food source. With
It's
that,
like, think back to when you're Halloween candy, right? The candy
yeah.
corns.
Yeah.
Nobody wants them. They're all there at the end, and then you get to the end. You've eaten all the Snickers and M&Ms. You get all the good stuff's gone. You're like, I guess I'll eat them now.
I'll throw them in. Well, cool. Well, that can kind of concludes today's webinar. Thank you for joining us this evening. We had a really decent turnout. Again, a reminder, we have part 2 coming next week, same time on Tuesday. So if you haven't registered for that, go ahead and get registered. And this recording, if you do want to revisit it at some point, will be thrown up on YouTube here in the next day or two. And we'll send an email to all registrants, a link to that, just in case you want to go back and review it a little bit, or maybe you want to share it with somebody else, or just kind of watch it again. So be on the lookout for that. If nothing else, we'll kind of take off here. But if you have any questions at any point, if you want us to help look at maps, if you want to send us a picture and say, hey, does this look like a decent spot to think about sitting, or any of that type of stuff, we're here to help. So feel free to reach out to us through Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, email, phone call, fax, however you want to send a homing pigeon, however you want to reach out to us. We're more than happy to help walk you through this process. And it's something that we are very passionate about. We enjoy, we love doing, and we love helping new people get started. So thank you for joining us tonight, and have a good evening.
Ditto.
Ditto. And good luck this fall. Weather's cooling off. It's starting to feel like fall out there. I love
It
it.
is. It's feeling like it. It's time. Get out there
Time.
squirrel hunting or get scouting for dove.
Yep.
September 1st. If you can find a concentration of doves somewhere, it can be a lot of fun.
I tell you what, I've started to notice quite a bit more on power lines just here in town the past, honestly, probably the last 4 or 5 days. I've really started to see numbers pick up, even at my feeders too. They're really starting to show up.
Yeah, they start concentrating, they start feeding more urgently because they know that they might have to migrate. Of
Yep.
course, now with all the ornamentals we have in cities, a lot of doves don't even migrate, so we get some even in the winter, but still, there are a portion of them that migrate.
You bet. Awesome. Well, thanks everybody. We'll see you next week, hopefully.
Yep, see you there.